Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland. Tonight I thought I would talk about beloved rock artists and rock bands that, sadly, I will never go and see again. All right, so what got me into this whole line of thought to begin with? Well, first of all, I've been trying to procure tickets to go see Robert Plant and Alison Krauss as they're touring, and I started looking at who's out there touring, what they are charging, and what they are offering us for that particular charge. You see, I've never been a concert attendee who would be willing to pay just about anything to see his favorite rock artist. I've always been a little bit demanding of the artists that I choose to spend my money to go and see. I always expect them to be putting out new product and able to carry on a cracker jack show. But today, what do we get? We get a whole lot of artists that are just jukebox touring. In other words, they're playing their biggest hits to satisfy the most people. Unfortunately for me, this means that their latest concerts aren't anything that is moving forward. They're merely rehashing their career to the delight of paying audiences. Now, as I go through my list tonight, I'll give you my reasonings why I will never see these artists again. And I want you guys to keep that in mind because I want to hear from you in the comments. What rock artists or rock bands just don't do it for you anymore, and why don't they do it for you anymore? Give us your reasonings. I really want to hear from you folks. All right, so my first artist has got to be one of my favorite artists of all time. And of course, I'm talking about Paul McCartney. Now, I've mentioned many times on this channel that if I were to compare Paul McCartney and John Lennon, I can't make the distinction between them. I am a fan of both writers while in the Beatles and after the Beatles. But since John's murder, it's been Paul who, well, has been able to continually give us new product from 1980 onwards. And I've got to tell you, Paul has rarely disappointed me as far as his writing, but what he is charging for his shows through corporate sponsorship and an ever increasingly weakening voice, I have to say at this point, is he even worth the view? Now, I've got to tell you guys something. I am spoiled when it comes to Paul McCartney. I saw him first at the Cow Palace with Wings, the classic lineup, right? And it is not only one of 3 shows that I would have to put in contention as one of the tightest rock shows that I've ever been to, but I was afforded an upfront and close view of Paul. I was no more than 7, maybe 10 feet away from the man as he sat on a stool and sang Yesterday, for me personally, I'm sure. And guess what, folks? It cost me $22.50 to see him. Now, I went to see him a second time at Berkeley. This is around the time that he released Flowers in the Dirt, an album that is both brilliant and falls short at the same time. This time, Paul was about this big, right? And the giant 4 or 5 story screens that were projecting his image from where I was sitting were no bigger than that, guys. All right? So basically, I was relegated to watching this guy on an iPhone. Now, the show was great, but you know what? The biggest memory I have from that Berkeley show was walking around with my brother Gary just prior to the show, and we heard Paul McCartney and Wings going through their sound check. We both heard songs we had never heard before. Of course, during the course of the evening, I would forget those songs. I kept trying to keep them in my head because I was going to do some research to see if any of those songs had a demo recording, a rare demo recording by him, or if those were songs coming up on a future project. Now, when you go to a concert and you realize that the biggest thing you can say good about that concert was the sound check, a sound check, by the way, that I wasn't able to climb a fence over and see them do, and a concert that cost me literally well over 6 times the price it cost me to see him in 1976, I was a bit disappointed. The next time I paid to go see Paul McCartney was 2005. I got sick. I even paid double what I paid to see him at Berkeley, this time to be sure to get at least adequate seating. I got sick. I gave that ticket to my son, Chris, who went and saw it. And like my bass player in 1976, he was absolutely astounded at the show. Most people who see McCartney for the first time feel the exact same way. The man surrounds himself with great musicians, and on top of that, he is a great musician himself. But what does he have to offer me today? Not much. His voice isn't in really good repair. He hasn't adjusted his set list to accommodate his older voice, which I think he should do. And I've got to say, the only way that I would ever see Paul McCartney again would be in a more intimate setting, and it would have to be for the right. But don't get me wrong, Paul McCartney as a living artist, there is not another man or woman on planet Earth that is on his level. All right, next up, another rock band that I will never go see. Now, this band isn't currently touring. They just finished a tour, and there's only 2 of them left in the band. And the lead singer is out touring now, saying that they will never tour again, or at least he doesn't foresee a time in which they will tour again. And yet we have seen them break that promise many times over the decades, haven't we? Of course, I'm talking about The Who. Now, I saw The Who at the Cow Palace as well. That was the concert that Keith Moon supposedly passed out twice. I only saw him pass out once, but I was pretty wasted myself that night, Keith. But what a fabulous show. They were touring Quadrophenia, a brand new album. There's a checklist off there, brand new material. I loved the album. They were moving forward, and all 4 of the classic lineup were there. I remember being absolutely astounded, and this was at a time that I was playing lead guitar in a band, right? I was astounded by John Entwistle's bass playing. I mean, that man must have had early compressors on his bass, because I gotta tell you, it's either that or finger technique and a special amp. That man's bass popped clearly, and yet at the same time did not muddy what we heard. But when Keith Moon passed away, I basically lost interest in the band. And when John Entwistle passed away, that was the last straw. There was no Who at that point. As a matter of fact, there was no Who the second that Keith Moon died. They should have done what Led Zeppelin did and folded up the whole thing and then start concentrating on their own individual solo careers. But for the most part, when they have toured as a duo calling themselves The Who, it's again nothing more than a jukebox performance at the concerts. No matter whether they have put out new music or not, Paul's also guilty of this, playing 1 to maybe 4, possibly on a real popular album, 5 cuts. The rest of it's all stuff that the paying public wants to see, and of course that's Won't Get Fooled Again, Baba O'Reilly, and their big hits. But here's a question for the tribe. What do you guys think of The Who when you see 1 half of the band up there with a stage full of musicians filling out the sound? Do you really think you've seen The Who live? For me, that's not The Who. The Who haven't really been The Who since Moon's death. And so they have nothing to offer me live. And on top of that, increased ticket prices for the pleasure, just don't do it for me. Sorry, Petey, I will not be going to see you again, or at least not as The Who. All right, next up, a band I've covered a whole lot on this channel. Of course, I'm talking about the Eagles, one of my favorite bands. As far as songwriting, this band was chock full of songwriters, and two of them were fabulous, supplying this band with most of their hits. I am a major Joe Walsh fan, way before he ever joined the Eagles. He's not really a full-time Eagle. We've talked about that in the past. And so when he came aboard, I was even more excited about this band. They played in 2005 at Sonoma State University, close to where I live. Now, these were in the earlier sort of days of corporate sponsorship, a thing that started happening in the mid-90s and really took hold by the time you hit the mid-2000s, and this was 2005. So I couldn't afford tickets to go see them. My family and I were driving by the university, and I just pulled the truck over to the side, climbed a fence, and watched them from afar. They were absolutely fantastic from what I can see, and a whole stage full of heroes from my musical past. But today, I mean, they call themselves the Eagles. I really only see one Eagle on stage, and I've explained that before in some of my other videos. Check them out. Don Henley is the only true Eagle left. There were only 5 true Eagles, the 4 original, all right? We had Don Henley, Glenn Frey, Bernie Leadon, and Randy Meisner. And these guys asked Don Felder to join as a full-time lead guitarist for the band and was given full membership. Well, they kicked him out. Randy has passed away. Bernie Leadon has retired and won't have anything to do with these guys, leaving only Don Henley and 2 hired guns, Timothy B. Schmidt and Joe Walsh, for the shows. And on top of everything else, Don Henley is guilty of lip syncing. Now, we're talking about a vocalist that I would consider in the top 20 of all rock vocalists. This guy had an incredible voice, and he may still have an incredible voice. We don't know. Maybe it's just that the day in, day out singing is wearing his voice down, and after the 3rd or 4th show, we start hearing cracks, and so he's decided to just lip sync to a more pure recording of his voice, and I think that sucks. That's cheating. I don't like using backing tracks. Now, when I say backing tracks, I'm not talking about a church bell that rings as the band plays their hits, right? Okay, or I'm not talking about a computer envelope repeat cycle going on as The Who play some of their stuff from Who's Next. I heard plenty of that when I saw them, but the vast majority of what was coming over that PA system that night was pure 100% The Who. And besides that, once you have a lip syncer, then you've got a band that is relying on backing tracks, and lip syncing is like the last thing that happens in that chain of events. They've already added backing tracks to make up for anybody who is not 100% as sharp as they used to be. So that one-time peer over a fence on a eucalyptus tree will be my one and only time that I'll ever go see the Eagles. But let's get back to that Who concert at the Cow Palace, because the next band that I want to talk about were there that night. Of course, I'm talking about Lynyrd Skynyrd. Now, I remember tolerating Lynyrd Skynyrd. I know, bad call, Michael. But I had heard a couple of their hits on the radio. I was just barely getting introduced to them. And I've got to tell you, I was there for The Who. I didn't give a damn who opened up for them, what other band, what other talent. I wanted to see The Who. But they were hot that night, and I caught up on the band immediately after the concert and wished that I had paid more attention while they were there. Of course, there is no other band in rock and roll that has ever experienced such tragedy as this band. I didn't care that Ronnie's younger brother was the lead singer later on. They were still putting out occasional albums, and I do have a penchant for Southern rock, being a big Allman Brothers fan, and until quite recently, I've got to tell you, if there was one band that I would go see that was just there performing the major hits for their fans, it would be this one. Even the replacement members that came along and filled out the lineup of this band wound up being with the band for the most part for long periods of time. This is one of those bands like Yes that changes over time, and so a particular lineup isn't as important to that band's history as, say, a band like The Who. To me, The Who is like the Beatles, right? Led Zeppelin. There are 4 members in all 3 of those bands, and they aren't the name of those bands if one member is missing. But with the passing of Gary, finally, and the band just bound and determined just to be a road show, a traveling jukebox, I have to say I have no inclination to go and see these guys anymore. Now, it can be said they haven't been who they've been claiming to be for decades. And if that's your belief, I can't argue with it. After all, I'm pretty famous for saying certain bands aren't the bands they are touring because of the very same reasons. But this was a kind of a brotherhood and friends stepping in. I was a little more forgiving when it came to Lynyrd Skynyrd. But just like the fake Guess Who out there, these guys are just performing their hits, and I've totally lost interest in the band. All right, next up, probably my 4th favorite band. As soon as I say that, another day I'll go, no, that's Deep Purple. But Queen, all right? Most of you know I've kind of put all my favorite bands in this fictional Mount Rock Olympus hierarchy, right? And the top 3 bands representing Zeus, Poseidon, and bad boy Hades is the Beatles as Zeus, Led Zeppelin as Poseidon, and Pink Floyd as Hades. Now, beyond those 3 bands, the next 10 bands that are on that list, I have never listed them in order. But if I was ever tempted to give an official, this is my number 4 band, Queen would be it. You know, I saw them at Winterland, and I didn't even go to see them. They blew me away so much I forget the rest of the concert. I had never seen so much sound come out of 3 musicians for the most part and a lead singer. Of course, Freddie would play keyboards, and that's one of the magical things about Queen. Their lead singer wasn't just a great lead singer who could play maybe some harp or strum some open guitar chords, right? No, Freddie Mercury was also their keyboard player, and that added dimension to what I saw that night. I immediately bought Queen 2, which is, I guess emotionally, my favorite Queen album. Night at the Opera is very close to that, and so is Sheer Heart Attack. I mean, think of these 3 albums and just what they did there, and they accomplished so much more over the decades. This was a band that grew and developed their sound all the way through their entire history, just like the Beatles. I went to see them a few years later and even paid for a friend to go see them because nobody I knew had gone to see them, and I wanted proof that there was actually a rock band that sounded like they did on record, and records that were highly produced. So we went to see them in a sit-down theater. I know, you guys are jealous. Everybody else is crowded around 500,000 people to see these guys. And I saw them in the most intimate setting that you could possibly imagine. They had just released Night of the Opera, and their stage presentation had only tripled by that time. But of course, tragedy always hits the greatest bands and the greatest artists, it seems, doesn't it? When Freddie Mercury passed away, they not only lost one of the greatest lead vocalists that rock had ever known. But they had also lost their keyboard player and one of their major writers in that band. Now you got to keep in mind, I wasn't a Queen fan because of Freddie Mercury. I was a Queen fan because of Freddie Mercury, Brian May, John Deacon, and Roger Taylor. I was a deep fan of all four of these. All four of these guys wrote hits. John Deacon came out of nowhere several times, surprising the hell out of his partners by writing wonderful hits for this band. This was a band of co-equals. This was a band that should have split up the second Freddie died. But what did they do? They brought on another one of my favorite vocalists of all time, Paul Rodgers, to take his place for concerts. I even bought that damned CD, played it for about 2 weeks, and never listened to it again. Now, how is that possible? Queen is one of my favorite bands in rock and roll, and Paul Rodgers, and Bad Company for that matter, are one of my favorite singers and bands in rock and roll as well. And here we have Queen with Paul Rodgers. I mean, you know, Paul Rodgers wasn't quite the vocalist that Freddie was, in that he could sing any genre, but he was down and dirty, and when he sang his style, every bit the vocalist that Freddie Mercury was. But he didn't fit Queen. After he left, they brought on a contest winner, a guy with no freaking history on this band, a guy that doesn't have enough history to tour with any band from this era, and he's nothing but a showboat, and I can't stand Queen when they tour with this guy, Adam Lambert. Brian May has been interviewed time and time again. He has talked time and time again about how there has been talk about a new Queen album, but it never seems to materialize. The same old problem. You know, a lot of these bands don't write new material because it's not financially solvent for them. It's more financially rewarding for them to go on tour and just play the hits that every moron wants to hear. And morons line up in mass to see this band. And guess what? Every single one of you that have gone to see Adam Lambert or Paul Rodgers play live with Queen, you haven't seen Queen. You haven't seen Queen. I'm sorry. You couldn't have seen Queen. You see, Freddie wasn't there. If you told me that you went and saw the Beatles because Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr were up on stage, I'd call you on that as well. You haven't seen Queen. Nobody who has seen Queen, and only the Queen after Freddie, has ever seen this band, so quit your bragging. Now, you may have seen great talent when you went to see them, and I'll even concede that some of you think Adam Lambert is a great vocalist. Yawn. But here's the deal. Half of the band is, first of all, missing. And the reason I loved this band was because of their songwriting, not just their ability as musicians, which blew me away. You know, I couldn't believe it. This is the most talented, advanced musician band that I've ever heard that writes on this level. But go and see them and even look at a ticket that says Queen on it, never gonna freaking happen. I made up my mind that I had seen Queen enough. I had seen them twice with Freddie, and I was blessed to have attended those shows. All right, we're down to the last couple of bands I wanted to talk about tonight. Led Zeppelin is one, and if I was to be honest and fair, I would say that I wouldn't go see Led Zeppelin under any circumstances whatsoever, for the same reason I wouldn't go see The Who. Their drummer, the greatest drummer in rock and roll, John Bonzo Bonham, passed away, and from that point on, that band was over. Now, there's been a couple of reunions of sort, as much as you can call them Led Zeppelin, the most famous of which was their live concert at the O2 Arena with Jason Bonham, John's son, and that was a fabulous concert. But if for any reason Robert Plant or Jimmy Page decided to get together with John Paul Jones and perhaps Jason to do one more concert, one more farewell concert, or one more short farewell tour, I'll break my rule every single time. I admit it. I'm a hypocrite. I would go see them just to watch Jimmy play and Robert sing. But for those of you purists out there, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't go see them for the very same reasons. But Led Zeppelin, like the Beatles, to me, they get a pass on a lot of areas, mainly because of what they accomplished musically and how they accomplished it in their own mythos, their own story. That leads to a band that I saw in the early 90s down in the peninsula, Yes. Now, that night is one of the concerts I was talking about that would be up for contention as one of the tightest concerts that I've ever seen in my life. It's got to be between McCartney and Wings, Queen, and Yes. It was a summer's night under a tented arena. I loved it. And the band up there wasn't even the classic lineup that I truly adored from Yes. But Yes, again, as I've mentioned before, part of their membership is an ongoing thing, and this has been from their outset. They trade members like kids trade baseball cards. But you know, for me, it got to the point that as long as there was John Anderson up there, Steve Howe, and Chris Squire with Alan White drumming, I was okay with that lineup. When Alan White and Chris passed away and Yes quit working with John Anderson, I was totally done with that band. There is no way I was going to see them live. That is, until they released Mirror to the Sky. I have already stated that I particularly love that album and that I considered it the album of the year, surpassing efforts by Jethro Tull, Metallica, Paul Rodgers, even the Rolling Stones' Hackney Diamonds, an album that I love. I think it's one of their better albums. Not at the tip top, but a very good, solid Stones album. Mirror to the Sky buried these other contenders for me, folks. And when I hear this album, I hear Yes, and yet there's only Steve from the classic lineup. But again, you gotta give me a break here, folks, because guess what? One of my contingencies is a band needs to be out touring and producing good quality content. And guess what? They're out touring, they're called Yes, Steve is the connection for that, and Mirror to the Sky justifies this lineup. I can't believe I'm saying that. So Yes is the one band on this list that I told myself I will never go see again, along, of course, with Led Zeppelin, where I've changed my mind. What about you guys? I want to hear from you. Have you given up trying to go see any of these artists I've covered tonight? Or if you're one of those that would be happy to go see the artists I covered, are there other bands or artists that you have put on the kibosh list? That's it. Not enough for me to put X amount of money, X amount of effort to go see them do X amount of nothing. All right, folks, that about covers the video for tonight. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. That always helps distribute the video to a wider audience. I've been off the channel for the last week, mainly because I am setting up my channel memberships. Now, you all know that I have a Patreon account, and I'm going to be doing something totally different over on Patreon. We're going to be covering albums. I'm going to be covering particular songs and do an entire set of videos based on talking about individual cuts, favorite cuts from classic rock that I just absolutely adore. Now, all of that will be handled on my Patreon side. On my membership side, I will be doing a series of videos directed on one particular subject and try and get it covered within 5 to 7.5 minutes, a whole new series. And that will be available as additional content to my members, and it doesn't matter which tier you're on, you will be able to access those videos. Now, I'll be sharing those videos over here on the main channel, at least temporarily, to give you a taste of what's going on in the memberships. Now, the reason I've gone into memberships is the channel is trying to become self-sustaining, and some of you have been so wonderful in blessing this channel by supporting it financially. And by the way, none of this has anything to do with what I will be doing here on the main channel. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who don't financially support this channel, there are 100 ways, well, more than 2 or 3 anyway, that you can support this channel. Give my video a thumbs up. That helps distribute the video. More people see the video. New subscribers. The channel grows. You've done me a great service by doing that. Watching my videos. Hey, man, that's the #1 thing that you do on this channel to support it. Views are important. All right, folks, I'm Michael Noland. This is The Bottom Line, and like I always say, the bottom line as I see it. Because, you know, it's in the comments where we are the tribe.